Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the museum's Chats on the Past program, where we discuss history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name, as always, is Nicole Carpenter. I am the Programs and Collections Director here at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. As we begin, we would like to recognize the Paugussett people, who are the indigenous communities native to this region. We'd also like to recognize that the museum and the town of Westport are built with and on the unceded indigenous homelands of the Paugussett people. As always, we are pleased to offer this program free of charge. We do have a suggested donation of $5 if you would like to support any of our free programming in the future. This helps us keep them going. We understand this is still a very difficult time, and we hope that you will support the museum however you can. This also includes following and liking us on social media. On Facebook and Twitter, you can follow us at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. This will notify you of any of our free programs in the future, such as tonight's program. If you've missed any of our free programs, you can also view them on our Facebook and YouTube channels just by searching the name of the museum. During our program tonight, if you have any questions or comments, anecdotes, anything that you would like to share or ask, please enter them in the comments box, and we will go through as many of those as we can at the end of our presentation tonight. For this evening's discussion, I'd like to hand it over to the museum's executive director, Ramin Ganeshram.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and welcome, Liz. We're so excited to have you here today. We had a little snafu last time, and I know we had a full audience waiting to see and hear you. So we're so delighted that this can go on today. For our audience, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about Liz Petry, Elisabeth Petry, who is a native born and I think raised for the most part in Old Saybrook, the only child of George and Ann Petry. Ann Petry is, of course, the great American novelist, and in fact, the first African-American woman whose fiction who wrote a novel that sold over 1 million copies. And we're going to get to talk about her a bit with her daughter, Liz. Liz has a BA from Vassar College and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And she worked for more than 15 years as a journalist at the Middletown Press, the Meriden Record Journal, and the Hartford Courant. In fact, I was just reading one of your articles today, Liz, for some research I was doing. She is the editor of Can Anything Beat White? A Black Family's Letters, based on some 400 letters that her grandmother saved that were sent between different members of her family. With her cousins Ashley James and Catherine Golden, she is developing a documentary film based on these letters. Liz is also the author of At Home Inside, A Daughter's Tribute to Ann Petry. She lives in Middletown with her husband, Larry Riley, who was a dog trainer and past commander of the American Legion Post 75, and she conducts a writing workshop for military veterans at Russell Library in Middletown. Welcome, Liz. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Ramin. Thank you, Nicole. And I'd like to say a special thank you to my friend Lucy Bowen, who may or may not be watching from California, because she was the one who introduced Ramin and me, and I'm just so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. And just before we start with the questions, I have a piece of really exciting news that I just found out this afternoon, and that is that we got an NEA grant for the documentary. I don't have details because Ashley hasn't sent the email yet, but we will be able to continue with production of the documentary.
That is great news. That is so good to hear. Thank you for letting us be the first people to publicly hear that. That's exciting, because I'm very much looking forward to that documentary.
Thank you.
Great. So let's jump in, because I know that we have a lot of people who are so interested in your story and your family story. And your family history is fascinating, and in many ways the influence of your works directly and indirectly. But I want to speak about, first, Can Anything Beat White, right? Which is I'm going to hold it up. Let's see all my note papers in there. Sorry. A Black Family's Letters. So I'm hoping you can set it up for us to, tell us about your grandfather, and who was emancipated out of slavery, and he came to Hartford, Connecticut, and kind of how he built this family, between whom these letters were sent, in the late 19th century. And then we can go on and talk about the other books.
Okay. Well, actually, Willis James, the gentleman you're referring to, was my great-grandfather. He's my mother's grandfather. Right. He ran from a Virginia plantation sometime during the Civil War, and we know he was living in Hartford in 1866 because his wife gave birth to a son there, and there's a birth record. They were actually living over the coachman's place for the Jewell family, and Marshall Jewell actually became governor of Connecticut, and then later Grant's ambassador to Russia following the Civil War. Willis James married 3 times, and my great-grandmother was the second wife, and the letters that we have that you referred to are all exchanged among the members of that second family. My grandmother, Bertha, was the oldest, and she saved everything. I always joke that I never needed to watch this show Hoarders because I lived it. We were kind of the anti-Marie Kondo. But one of the things that she did save, which was just phenomenal, were these 400 letters. They were written between about 1890 and 1910. She stayed home. She lived in Hartford and then moved to Saybrook after she and my grandfather opened the store down there, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But everybody else in the family traveled. So we have letters from the man who fought in the Philippines in 1898 following the Spanish-American War. One of her sisters went to Hawaii by herself, started out as a maid, became a teacher, and a manager of an orphanage. She had, of course, the other sister who's famous that I know we'll talk about also is Anna Louise James, who was the first African-American woman to get a pharmacy license in Connecticut. But these letters are so amazing because, well, part one, because not that many people were literate, Black or white at that time. Very few people exchanged letters, and the fact that they were preserved was just amazing. And I learned more history reading these letters and doing research for that book than I ever learned in school. And it kind of made me angry that these kind of resources exist. And I think now kids are beginning to do primary resource research, but back when I was in school, that didn't exist. We learned about General Washington, and we learned about the Civil War, but we never learned about the people that actually did the work and made the journeys and so forth. So that's how that got started. And what actually caused me to write the book or do the editing was I was reading through this pile of letters, and I came across one that was written by my grandmother's younger brother, also named Willis. And he said, my dear Bertha, please send $35. I shot a white man for bothering me, and I'm in a Georgia jail. And the sheriff says that if I give him the $35, he'll spirit me away into Florida. Otherwise, I'm going to be lynched. And after I finished reading that letter, I sat down and said, this is a book. I had spent my career dealing with history that happened 5 minutes ago or an hour ago or yesterday. But this was 100-year-old history that was just crying to be told. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's how the book came about.
And it's an amazing book because, in the introduction by Farah Jasmine Griffin, she makes a point, and I think this is a point that really needs to be made. These letters took place during what we generally think of as the low point in African American history. It was the period right after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, into the early 20th century. A period where there were many lynchings, right? This is when Ida B. Wells did her groundbreaking work to share information about lynching and what was going on in the South. And there's so many things that are covered in these letters as part of a family speaking to one another, even if it's observationally, right? So this experience of your great uncle, Willis James Jr., right, is essentially a first-person account of the threat of lynching. But they also talked about things like voter disenfranchisement, right? They talked about legal segregation. And I think I read a reference, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, to the 1896 Plessy case at some point, or in the.
It wasn't Plessy. It was 1906. It was the White Riot in Atlanta.
Yes,
that one of my grandmother's friends wrote her this long account, and I was not aware, and I don't know that anybody else has come up with any first-person accounts from the Black perspective of what happened in that one of a series, because it was Wilmington in 1896,
right.
Atlanta, and then of course in 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Tulsa.
And these were things that were, I mean, they were written about in the Black press, but they never became part of our history. And it just it got me. The other thing that I just want to say briefly, one of the things that I found so incredible was that in spite of the fact that these were people who had clearly been discriminated against, they were not treated like first-class citizens. When they went to other places, they treated the local people the same way they had been treated at home. It was because Willis was referring to the local people in the Philippines as dirty and lazy, and I thought, wait, that's exactly what they were calling you when you were living in Georgia, right? Yeah. Helen talked about how horrible the Buddhists are in Hawaii. I mean, you know, it was kind of like they were part of kind of this imperialist advance that was of the United States. It was very much, I thought, just exclusively white culture, and clearly not.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating as well. And I started to think about it from many different perspectives. And, you kind of see, without getting into the weeds, how people who are disenfranchised in their own nation, given an opportunity to have status elsewhere, how kind of alluring that can be, right? And that's how I read it. And then the larger point that othering, right, which we still talk about today, can happen in all kind of levels of society among all different ethnicities, which is not to take away from the overarching aspects of white supremacy in any way, right? But it's an interesting point to examine. I mean, I think, the thing about this book is that it represents so much the fullness of Black life at this period of time through this family. And what I really love about the book, is the fact that for me, you talked about, these are people, in their own words, who are intelligent people, educated people, successful people, entrepreneurial people. And it really spoke to me about this idea of an uplifted story, presenting the story of people who were successful, who really were able to rise above, who had joy in their life, and who also had hardship as well. But it wasn't a singularly downtrodden story. And as historians, this is what we're trying to do, right? While telling the entire truth of it, teasing out those stories that have joy and uplift on some level, right? And I really loved that about this. And of course, not contrived, because they're writing in their own words. They're just telling us their life, right?
Exactly.
So part of the, you talked about your aunt who was, working in Hawaii, and your well-traveled Uncle Willis. I think that as you mentioned, sort of the most, at least famous Connecticutian of among these siblings was Ms. Anna Louise James, right? And so for those of you who don't know, just as Liz had mentioned, Ms. James was the first Black female pharmacist in the state of Connecticut. She owned and ran a very successful pharmacy in Saybrook for decades, right? Is that right, Liz? For decades. In fact, I understand that our colleagues at Lockwood Matthews Mansion Museum right now are opening tomorrow, I believe, an exhibit on 19th century medicine, and there's a whole room dedicated to Miss James. So I encourage everybody to please go. It's so great. So I encourage everybody to please go see that. I think it'll be very, uplifting and enlightening to read and see about her. But can you talk about her a little more? I mean, because you have both the perspective of history, but she was your great aunt, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, she was amazing. Everybody in the family worked in the pharmacy. I worked there when I was 14 years old for practically no money. I mean, they believed in exploiting children as long as they were members of your family, right? So, but she was a pillar in the community. And I just recently, a couple of years ago, my husband and I were having some work done on the house, and the guy came from Deep River, and we got talking, and he wound up giving me a friends and family discount because Miss James had saved his grandfather's life. And this was, all these decades, I mean, she's been dead since 1977, but all these decades later, her legacy lives on. Wow. She gave a very young and insecure woman bus fare to go to New York to audition for the theater. That woman was Katherine Hepburn. She kept the keys to the Congregational Church across the street. The summer people, when they left for the winter to go back to New York or Hartford or wherever, they left the keys with her. So if a workman needed to get into the house, she had the keys. I mean, that's how she was regarded in the community. And I've thought a lot about how she wound up in that situation. And I think it was a confluence of her mother died when she was 8. Of tuberculosis. And one of the things she said years and years and years ago was that she never remembered seeing her mother as a healthy person. Number two, she moved in, after her mother died, she moved in with my grandmother, Bertha, and Peter, her husband. And they had a little girl who died of peritonitis when she was 3 while Miss James was living with them. And the third thing, and of course, those 2 deaths, I'm sure had a huge impact on the whole family. Yeah. But the third thing was my grandfather, Peter Lane, was the first African-American in Connecticut to get a pharmacy license. And he opened that pharmacy. She worked for him for a number of years. And I'm sure that was a third part of the inspiration for her to go to pharmacy school in Brooklyn with the financial help of some wealthy ladies from Hartford. But she was determined that I think she was going to help the community, and she sure did. The kids loved her. I was talking to a woman, this was just a few years ago, and she said, she and her brothers and sisters used to go into the pharmacy after school and tell Miss James they hadn't had anything to eat, and Miss James would fix them sandwiches. And Kate said, I'm sure she knew we'd eaten lunch, but she just loved feeding us. But that was the kind of person that she was.
Yeah. And I remember seeing, I don't recall where I saw it at this point now, it might be in your book or elsewhere, that she was a great lover of the theater. Is that right? And that she would always travel to New York.
That was my mom. That was
your mom. Sorry. We'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, that was your mom.
My James never left that pharmacy except for half a day at Christmas, half a day at Thanksgiving, a half a day at New Year's. I mean, she was just there. Well, state law is you have to have a licensed pharmacist on the premises if the store is open. So she was it. My mother did become a pharmacist and worked there on and off, but she was in that store from the time she opened 8 or 9 in the morning until she closed at 8 or 9 at night.
Amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. And so I think what's really interesting, about these stories is that you come from a family, not just of entrepreneurial people, but entrepreneurial women, right? Who were, as Miss James, business and community leaders. Your grandmother, Bertha, she also had a business, right? Of course, your grandfather, 3 businesses, right?
She ran, it was lace and linen that she made. And there was a letter that's since been lost from a white woman in Appalachia who said that the work that my grandmother sent her saved her family's life after her husband lost his job in the mines. And I wish I don't know whatever happened to that, but it wasn't in the collection because the rest of those letters are at the Beinecke now. But in any event, that she had that, she was a hairdresser. She had a license. She was had a barber's license from Connecticut, and she was a chiropodist, which these days is a podiatrist, but she did fingernails and toes back in the day. So those were her three businesses, and she kind of had a corner of the store, the where the pharmacy was. That was from where she operated from. So, and she raised children. I mean, she had two children, right? So she's doing all of this and running three businesses and taking care of the house and so forth.
Right. And you know, of course, then your mother, being one of those children, right, being raised in this environment, as you said, she becomes a pharmacist, right? She's working in the pharmacy, but then she becomes a novelist. And I'm really interested in knowing how that happened, right? And I mean, I think this hooks back into, you know, so there's two books we want to talk about. At Home Inside, which is a daughter's tribute to Ann Petry, and which is, of course, you wrote about your mother. And then Library of America, with your help and guidance and editorship, has just reproduced one volume of her two novels, right?
Well, Sarah actually is the editor on the Library of America. She did the timeline, and that is incredible. The back of that volume has just every detail about my mother's life, and she dug up stuff I didn't know. You know, one of the problems with my doing that Home Inside was that she saved a lot of stuff, but she also destroyed pretty much all of her journals and her writings from the time she lived in New York. I know you reacted the way every historian I have ever, it's like, oh my God, what did she do? And I'm pretty sure that the reason was that she and my dad were members of what has come to be called the Harlem Left. And there was an affiliation with, if they weren't members of the Communist Party, they were what was called fellow travelers. And there were a couple of the people that were involved that I know she knew that did get hauled before HUAC. So I think that's why she destroyed all of that. But it's a resource that's gone. You know,
that's tragic.
Yeah, I know.
Understandable. Yeah. I mean, there was real terror, you know, surrounding the activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, right? And I could see why she did it, but what a loss.
I know. And you reacted exactly. Every historian I have ever told that to does the same thing. It's like clutch their heart and go, oh no, no.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I know. So, and of course I wasn't born yet. So, you know, I had no personal knowledge of any of this. They had moved back to Connecticut by the time I was born. So I had her journals from the 70s and 80s, and some of her very early stuff is up at Boston University, and now her more recent ones, I gave those to the Schomburg. And that's all open for people. I don't even know if we finished cataloging all of it, but it's available for people to look at. And we're hoping to get another Library of America copy, you know, maybe her journals, maybe some more essays, and a couple of the other books and stuff. So, but
that would be really wonderful.
Yeah. I would love to see that happen.
So Liz, do you know how she made the transition from pharmacist to writer? Actually,
she had been writing from the time she was about 16 years old, and the story she tells, and I'm assuming she didn't make it up, although I did discover that there were places where she fabricated pieces of her life. She was in high school, and the assignment was Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And there's a character in there named, I think it's Jeremy Cruncher. I'm not sure I got his first name right, but he, quote, resurrects bodies. In other words, he's a grave robber. And the assignment that she got from her English teacher, that everybody got, was to create their own scene based on characters from this book. And she wrote a scene between Jeremy and his wife, which doesn't appear in the novel anywhere. Right. And she wrote it on a Friday or whatever, went home for the weekend, came back, and the teacher, she said, the teacher didn't like her. She didn't like the teacher. But the teacher read her story to the class, and my mother's sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, she's going to say, this is absolutely not what you should do. And this teacher looked at her afterward and said, I think if you put your mind to it, you could become a writer. And that's what started her on the path. So she was writing the whole time she was working in the family pharmacy. She was sending in stories She didn't get published until after she had gotten married, moved to New York, and took a course from a woman named Mabel Louise Robinson at Columbia University. And apparently this woman was phenomenal. I mean, she published some of her own stuff, but she was one of these people that just was able to encourage writers. There were a couple of others, and I'm not going to remember the names of them, but they're people who during the 40s and 50s were household names. With the things that they had written. And
Wow.
after she took Miss Robinson's class, she published in The Crisis. She published a couple of other short stories. And then Houghton Mifflin approached her and said, "Are you working on a novel?" And she said, "No, but I could be." And that's how The Street got started.
That's amazing. And so for those who may not recall, The Crisis was and now is the online, but was the magazine of the NAACP.
Right.
So,
Right. It was started.
I remember always seeing it on our
One
coffee
of those.
table.
Yeah, one of those circular ironies, because W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the people that started both the NAACP and The Crisis, and Helen, the one that went to Hawaii, studied with him at Atlanta University. So there are these kind of layers of contact and connection.
Yes, I remember. I made a note about that she had studied with Du Bois. I was like, wow. I mean, talk about one family touching kind of all of the like sort of star points. It's amazing. So tell us about The Street. I think our listeners would really love to hear about this.
Well,
novel.
It's a story about a woman trying to raise a child by herself in Harlem. It's set in the 1940s. And basically she's facing down what I call the triple threat of racism, sexism, and poverty. Now, the book was published in 1946. It's been in print ever since. And the thing that my mother said when it came out in 1992, I think, in a new edition, that she wished it had become a historical artifact instead of still being current events, which, of course, now, sadly, it still is in 2021. Yeah. But that's the story. She got the germ of the idea, she said, because she had been teaching in an after-school program in Harlem, and the kids would come in with keys on ribbons around their necks. So they're the original latchkey kids. And then she read some little news account about a little boy who had been arrested for stealing from mailboxes, and that was where the other piece of it came through. So and it is. I mean, it's a wrenching story. It's an incredible story. But what makes it so sad is that she said in 1992, all she had to do was add guns and drugs, and she could write exactly the same story. And the same thing now.
It's true. It's so true. When I was reading it, I was thinking, except for the period references and the absence of technology, it is virtually the same story for many people, which is both appalling and tragic, right?
Right.
And then, so tell us about the reception of this novel. This novel was a block,
She always joked. She said, my husband went off to war and he came home, found his wife was a famous writer. So, because he got drafted, it was World War II, right? And it was published originally in 1946. She was in demand. The phone was ringing off the hook. Of course, then it was newspapers and radio. There was no TV to speak of. But she said she couldn't get any work done. So, and you had asked about why they moved back to Old Saybrook, or why they moved to Old Saybrook. Well, they had moved out of Harlem in 1943 or 44 to way up in the Bronx, which was back then kind of a leafy green substitute for Harlem, because they both had grown up in the countryside. I mean, my mother grew up in Old Saybrook, which is about as rural as you could get. I think there were 1,000 people there. My dad came from New Iberia, Louisiana, which was also, when he was growing up, a tiny little town. Its claim to fame is Tabasco sauce. And I was down there a number of years ago. There's still, I think, maybe 13,000 people. These are little tiny rural communities. So neither one of them was accustomed to what Harlem had, with all the hustle and bustle and the traffic and the noise and so forth. I think the Bronx was better, but she just decided that she had to get out of New York. And I think part of the reason they picked Old Saybrook was that she realized she could hide behind Miss James's shadow because she was the celebrity in the family. And there was a long time when people thought, even when I became an adult, people thought that there was one person, the pharmacist who wrote novels. They didn't realize that there were two separate people, but she got an unpublished phone number, and she was able to actually get some work done.
Get some work done and raise her family, right? You know, and which is
She served on the Board of Education. She was on the cemetery committee. She was doing all this public service work. She designed her own clothes. She sewed for both of us. She was she could have been a professional baker if she hadn't become a writer. You know, she could do interior design. I mean, I think she was a genius. You know, I mean,
she was clearly autodidactic, right? She was clearly, completely,
Yeah, because she went to pharmacy school. She never had she didn't have a Bachelor of Arts degree. She had 4 honorary doctorates though.
Right. It's just so remarkable, the story.
Yeah.
And then when she came back to Old Saybrook, right? Then she wrote The Narrows, right? Which
she had actually started both Country Place and The Narrows when she was still living in New York, but she finished both of them. That's Country Place. That was out of print up until last year or the year before. And that's based on the 1938 hurricane. And it's so funny because she and my dad got married in February of 1938, and then they moved to New York. The storm was in September, and she had come back for the weekend to visit her parents when that hurricane hit. So she was in Old Saybrook. And they say that killed like 700 people. I mean, they never found some of the bodies. It was kind of like Fukushima. It took out people and lives. And our next door neighbor was a little kid, and he said he remembers seeing 2x4s sailing past the house. And it was terrifying. And my cousin and I always say that we heard more about the 1938 hurricane than we ever did about World War II, which was much more immediate because the damage was so severe and everybody knew somebody who had been impacted by it because it came ashore right there. It hit the south shore of Long Island and then just roared across Long Island and it went right on up the Connecticut River. So they were right in the middle of it. And the story, I think the reason the story never was really that popular is that they've decided that Black people can't write about white people, and the main characters in the story are white.
That's fascinating to me because one wonders if she had written it under a pseudonym or people didn't know that it was her. You kind of wonder, would it have been, because she was a great writer. So, there's no reason why this book should have been any less received, but for that reason, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And then The Narrows, which is both a fascinating story, and also there's an aspect where people really want it to be Old Saybrook, but she said it's not Old Saybrook, right? It's
a city. It's a small city. And I think what she did, because I wrote an article for Connecticut Explored, the Connecticut History magazine, a couple of years ago where I talked about this. I think she combined elements of New London and Hartford because first of all, there are sailors, so it's conceivably New London because of the Navy base. Right. But it's also a manufacturing town. So Hartford with coal manufacturing, because the heroine, the white married lady, and her family made their money off of guns. It's kind of a I think it's a combination, but it's Country Place is definitely Old Saybrook. The Narrows is not. It's a city for sure. And there may be an element of Bridgeport in there because I think at one point they say that they're an hour away by train from New York. So that would be Bridgeport. But a lot of the descriptions are either Hartford or New London.
So can you tell everybody what The Narrows is about? Because I tell you, that book to me, so groundbreaking in its plot, in its setup, in its examination for the time that it was written. Can you tell us, first of all,
Sure.
it was published in, I don't remember the year that it was
It
published,
was
but
1953.
yeah.
It's based actually on an actual incident that happened in Hawaii in, I think, the 1930s, in which this woman who's the wife of a military officer accuses these 5 men. I think 2 are Native Hawaiian, one's Filipino. I don't remember. They're of various ethnic backgrounds, but they're not white. And she accuses them of raping her as apparently a cover-up because she's having an affair with someone. And the her mother and her husband conspire to try to kill these men. And the way it worked out in the actual fact of things was that they were convicted and their sentence was an hour in the custody of the governor of the island, and then they got to leave. So she took that story, and moved it to Connecticut. The affair is between a young, good-looking kind of Paul Robeson type guy, stunning black man, and this white married heiress, and with a similar result. But the thing about that book that I find, I think that's the best of the three novels, by far the best, because she does that stream of consciousness thing that is just phenomenal. And the characters are just wonderful. The characters are just terrific. You know.
They truly are. I have to say, as a writer myself, I wish that I had been introduced to these novels when I was much younger, because the craft of the writing, right? Now we can look at them and say they tell us stories that can teach us about history, and in fact, how history keeps repeating itself, because as we've said, these themes continue, right? Very strongly. Even in terms of a hurricane, we still deal with natural disasters. I mean, these themes still continue. And so there's that piece of it, but the craft of writing in these books is just so remarkable that, students of writing should be reading these, absolutely. So now you have a little clip from the film you're producing, right? That you're going to share with us, which we're excited to see. I still want to talk about it home inside, but I want to make sure we see this clip first.
It's like 9 minutes, and so we have plenty of time. I do have one thing that I want to add just about the street real quick, because people have asked how this woman who grew up in this little tiny town in Old Saybrook could write, such an angry novel. And I, try to say, well, she, was blown away when she was working for the newspaper, when she went to New York and so forth. But I finally came up with a contemporary comparison that I think works perfectly. And that is that it took a Jewish guy from Tampa, Florida, to walk into a newsroom in Boston, Massachusetts, and blow the lid off of those priests that were sexually abusing kids. Marty Baron had no dealings with Boston until he went to work at the Globe, and he took one look at that situation and said, "Oh no, we're going to pursue this," because everybody else had been so intimidated by the Catholic Church, and he was just like, "No, it's news. We're doing this." And the result was what we all know what the result was. And I think it happened with her, that she walked into this and went, "What?"
Yeah, I think that's very true, especially coming from a very prominent family where, they enjoyed a certain modicum of respect and, entrepreneurial and so on. I think, going to Harlem at that period of time and witnessing what was going on around her, I think that there's a clarity of that vision, and coming from the country and going to the city, there's a clarity of the outsider in a way, right? I mean, there's always the understanding based on racial parity, right? Foundationally. But being an outsider, a personal experience, I think it gives you a 20/20 sort of vision into what you're seeing, and being able to say, there's something not right here, right?
Right, exactly. And it's funny because Kwame Anthony Appiah, the man that writes the ethics column for the New York Times, called her an interloper in Harlem. And I thought, well, if it takes an interloper, then go for it.
That's right.
They're the ones that clearly can see kind of the four squares of what's going on. Yeah. Yeah.
100%. So tell us about this clip that you're really kindly sharing with us, which is pretty exciting. So tee it up for us.
So it's based pretty much on Can Anything Beat White, the letters, and how my mother used some of the stories and themes in those letters to create her fiction. I say it's like the first generation were the griot. They were the storytellers. Some of it was oral tradition. Some of it was just scribbled notes or letters or whatever. My mother polished them into fictional stories. And we're taking it to the digital age with the documentary. But it's the same story. It's the same narrative. But we're just doing it in 21st century format.
And diving a little bit deeper, sharing things that people wouldn't necessarily get from reading the novel, right?
Exactly.
Because
or reading the letters. Yes.
Or reading the letters.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're so excited. We have this NEA grant that may allow us to keep going with it. I do want to say that we were about to audition actors to read the letters and do the narration when COVID hit. So the voice that you hear is my cousin Ashley James, who's the filmmaker on the project. He's won awards for his work, and he's really phenomenal. But we are going to have different people reading the different letters.
So I think Nicole are you set it? Yeah, here we go.
Okay. Can I stop my camera? Yeah, I can stop my camera.
I am a New Englander, a Connecticut Yankee. Four generations of my family have been born in Connecticut. So to borrow a phrase from the Quakers, I am a birthright New Englander. But of course, I am not. I'm an outsider, not a member of the club, because my grandfather, Willis Samuel James, was a runaway slave who came here on the Underground Railroad before the Civil War.
Ann Petry is actually the link between a writer like Zora Neale Hurston, who publishes her best-known novels in the 30s, and the writers who we come to know in the 70s, someone like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, or Toni K. Bambara. Petry is one of the first women to give us a complicated working-class African-American woman character dealing with issues like racism and sexism.
I think what I admire about Ann Petry's work, especially her novel, The Street, is she really captures that feeling of Harlem in transition and maybe Harlem on the brink. Just a few years after, you have Langston Hughes's montage of A Dream Deferred with its famous What Happens to a Dream Deferred, the question that became Raisin in the Sun, and all that history, I think, sort of starts for me with Ann Petry's The Street.
One of the things that she writes about is being a Connecticut Yankee, born and raised in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. But she's very clear about the fact that she is not a member of the club. She is not a Connecticut Yankee. In fact, she describes herself as a survivor born in the USA.
Old Saybrook is a very old town. It's filled with the smell of salt and the sound of water birds. I knew the difference in the smell of the air when the tide was going out and how it freshened when the tide was coming in. The coves and inlets and creeks offer a perfect resting place for migratory birds. It's the picture-perfect New England village. Except the reality for me was something different. There's an ancient burial ground in town, said to be the oldest cemetery in Connecticut. In the back, there's a gravestone with the name Rose Jackson, a colored woman. There's no other gravestone near it. It's the 19th century equivalent of the back of the bus. And it's not only segregated, but the stone is facing backwards. Sister Rose Jackson's grave looks to the rear.
New England, in many ways, was the most homogeneous white region in the United States. William Lloyd Garrison called Connecticut the Georgia of the South. And despite a record of abolition and support for the Underground Railroad that's exemplary, that kind of undercurrent of racism among most white people in the state of Connecticut was consistent from the beginning of the Civil War through to World War I, and in fact, it increased after World War I and beyond.
How did my family manage to survive intact in this largely white community? How did my parents manage to give their children a sense of self-confidence, self-worth? My father, Peter Clark Lane Jr., was a licensed pharmacist. He opened a drugstore in Old Saybrook in 1902. And my mother, Bertha James Lane, was the eldest daughter of Willis James' 6 children. She was the rock of our family, a self-made entrepreneur, a mentor, and a guardian to all of us. And I had these amazing aunts and uncles. My Aunt Helen was a school teacher who taught in the Hawaiian Islands and created a successful correspondence course in reading and literature. My Aunt Lou, Anna Louise James, was the first woman pharmacist in Connecticut. She took over my father's drugstore in the 1920s, and it became the James Pharmacy. It remains a landmark, even today. And I had these extraordinary uncles. They were footloose and fancy-free, and lived all over the world. They were roustabouts with circuses, seamen, Pullman porters, barbers. One of them smuggled Chinese workers between the US and Canada. One of them was a Buffalo soldier in the Spanish-American War. One spent time on a Georgia chain gang, sentenced to 5 years after being caught in a small town after sunset. My uncles and aunts were storytellers, yarn spinners, and letter writers. Through these letters, I survived the pain. I learned about the world outside of Old Saybrook. Hampton, February 18th, 1902. Dear Peter, it has been snowing for the last 2 days, and the weather is really sloppy. The farm work has stopped for a while, and the snow was about 4 inches deep yesterday. There are about 500 colored boys here, and about 100 Indians. The Indians room in a large brick building called the Wigwam. The colored boys room in about 8 different buildings. One of the Indian boys died in the hospital last week. His death was brought on by an accident he had last fall. His body was sent to Cherokee, North Carolina, for he belonged to the Cherokee Indian tribe there. My dear Bertha, is it long since I've written you? I have no idea whatever, yet it seems weeks since I remember writing. On the broad veranda on which I am writing, one can look for miles across the Pacific, the eye traveling down the hillsides covered with sugarcane, coffee, and bananas. It seems as though the wonders of this place are inexhaustible. Nearly every night the sky is brilliantly illuminated by the light from the volcano, and I have read there is nothing dangerous from the lava flow. Saturday morning, Queen Liliuokalani called, accompanied by her attendant and ward, Joseph Leah. She was very regal and gracious, and she shook my hand. Just think, I have met a queen. With my aloas to all, I am ever fondly yours, Helen L. James. Jessup, Georgia, November 1st, 1905. My dear sister, I would not write again, but I am in a terrible fix that I got into after leaving Savannah, Georgia. While going through this place, I shot a white man for bothering me, and I tried to get away, but they put the bloodhounds on my track, and they caught me in a swamp and tried to lynch me. but the sheriff held him from me and got me to the jail where I am at present. I get tried Monday morning, but the sheriff is afraid they'll get me when I'm taken to the trial. He told me if I had any folks, I had better write to them at once and try to raise $35 to pay off his guards before the trial, and he would spirit me away in the night to Florida. Now, Bertha, for dear mother's sake, don't let me stay here to be killed by these white folks when a little of nothing will save me. Do this, and I will never forget your kindness. Kiss Louise for me, and if I never see you again, may God bless you and protect you. Goodbye from your own dear brother, Will James.
So
I mean,
we're in
that's
the process. Yeah,
so
we're in the
incredible.
process of trying to raise money so we can finish this. So people are so minded. I will send you a link where they can make donations to the Community Foundation in
Absolutely.
Middletown. Okay, all right. I will.
Please
I'll
do.
send the
Please
link
do.
in.
We'd be
Yeah,
happy to post that on our Facebook site. And but it's through the Community Foundation in Middletown that people
yeah,
can make the
yeah.
donations for the support of this
There's
project.
a James Family Letters Fund. I'll send you the actual link so that they can go right to it to the
That would be
donation if
great.
anybody's interested. Thank you so much. This is great.
Oh, our pleasure. So tell the audience, did Will get the money? Did he get out of Georgia?
Well, yeah, actually it's in the book. So
Yeah,
we don't know if he actually got the money, which by the way is more than $1,000 now. I mean, it's
exactly.
$35, but the average person does not kind of have $1,000 sort of just hanging around. I kind of looked at like the date of that letter, I think was a Wednesday, and he said he was going to get tried on Monday. The timing doesn't work out. And somebody else pointed out to me that, and I don't know how this was true, but this was kind of like the internet scams of, oh, your grandson has been, kidnapped. You need to send money. So, but the fact of the matter was that he did end up in Florida at some point not long after this. So it very well could have been true. The part of it that I think blew me away was he says in the letter, I shot a white man for bothering me. Like, really, dude?
I know. And I have to say, reading that, it does make me think, oh, that's interesting. That maybe it was the sort of internet scam of the day, because I think we all would have known what happened. The justice would have been meted out on the spot. Justice on the spot, right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly. Although there were law enforcement people who preferred money. So
yeah,
there's a possibility that he did, that he did pay a bribe, and that the sheriff took him over because he was right north of the Florida line. So it may have been easy for, it would have been easy enough to do it. But yes, I mean, the fact that he survived in jail for 4 days or whatever was I thought was phenomenal, given that he had shot somebody.
I mean, it really is
Yeah.
phenomenal. I think, what I think is so interesting about this book particularly, and reading it, is exactly what our colleague Walt Woodward, the Connecticut State historian, has said. And that is, even for a family like the James family, a prominent family, a successful family, an educated family, the underlying hostility of
Right.
white Connecticut residents toward Black Connecticut residents was there, and was foundationally because of a legacy of slavery. African Americans came to Connecticut as enslaved people, and that legacy and the prejudices from that legacy remained. And of course, legislatively, not having the right to vote until after the Civil War and the 15th Amendment and so on. So
and
I think no, go ahead, please.
I think there was another factor more close in time to all of this, and that was that Connecticut relied on the South up to almost the Civil War, because there was a lot of economic commerce back and they weren't going to rock the boat in terms of opposing slavery because that was their livelihood. And also family ties. I remember doing some research for something else and seeing over and over again, Mr. So-and-so of New Haven, Connecticut married Miss So-and-so of Charleston, South Carolina.
That's right.
So there were family ties, there were economic ties, and this was not that far removed when these folks were writing these letters. This was 1890 to 1910. So not that long afterward.
Not that long afterwards whatsoever, and not that long after what followed centuries, decades and centuries of that economic tie that was so bound up in slavery so tightly as the economic engine of this state, even once slavery was abolished here, supporting the South, as we know. So I want to give people a chance to ask you questions. I do want you to tell us a little bit first about At Home Inside, what people can expect from that book and what the book is about, because I don't want to leave that out. It's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, it started because Elisabeth Alexander had come to Wesleyan University to speak, and she invited my mother. Her mother's family and my mom had been friends for years, and she invited my mother. So I was playing chauffeur. I drove down, got my mom from Saybrook and drove her to Middletown. And at the end of her talk, Elisabeth Alexander said, and there's this world famous writer that you need to know. Her name's Ann Petry, and she's sitting here in the audience. And so I had to listen for the half-hour ride back to Old Saybrook about, oh my goodness, I look like hell. Oh my goodness, why did she have to point me out? People can know my writing, but they don't need to know me, and of course I didn't win that argument. The only way I won that argument was to write a book about her after she passed away. But I just wanted people to know that aside from being a phenomenal writer, she was just this hugely well-rounded, kind, generous, ladylike person that just people adored her. My friends used to say, "Oh, I wish you were my mother too," and it was true. She just had this quality about her, and of course she was kind of shy. And she'd sit there quietly and listen to people talk, and then the next thing you know, they'd wind up in a story.
It's amazing.
I just wanted the world to know an aspect of her that they didn't get from her writing or from any of the other things that had been written about her.
And really, truly, that she was a polymath. She was autodidactic. She was good at everything. There's nothing she wasn't good at.
Right.
Which is so delightful to just read about people like that. It's just so inspirational.
She had a friend whose grandson was failing economics. Now, I don't think she ever took an economics course in her life. She got a couple books out of the library, and the next thing I knew, she was teaching the kid economics. I couldn't do that, or if I could, but it would take me a whole lot longer than a month or so to get it together. Yeah, but that's just how she was.
Wow. And always kind of eschewed the limelight, right? Kind of really avoided being in publicity situations.
She hated doing things like this. She did them, but she did them under protest. And she did acting training. She worked with the American Negro Theater, so she had gotten so she wouldn't let people know how upset she was or how shy she was. But she didn't want anybody to be, she wanted people to read her works, but they didn't need to see her.
Right. Spoken like a true writer, actually.
Yeah.
So now I want to let Nicole have the opportunity to ask questions from the audience.
We do have a couple of questions from our audience. We also have some wonderful comments here that our viewers have shared with us, thanking you for being a part of our program, Liz.
Thank you.
The first question that we have here is from Sarah, and she asks if there are any newspaper articles from the time period from the alleged shooting that would shed some light on the veracity of that letter that was shared in the documentary. She says, it seems like the sort of event that might have been written about.
I never found anything. I did check with online newspapers, but I never found anything. I actually wrote to the court system down there, but one of the things I've discovered is we in Connecticut are very, very spoiled in terms of record keeping. And these were little tiny southern towns where Who knows whether they even bothered to write down the guy's name that he was in jail, So I've never been able to find any account. I was doing some stuff on my father's family and found 2 homicides and a suicide, not a word in any of the newspapers. And that was in Texas. Not a word in anything. So I don't think that there's anything that exists from that time period about the shooting.
Right. I also wanted to ask you, Liz, if you would tell our audience a little bit about the image that I am sharing on our screen now, because we didn't get to it earlier, and I definitely wanted to give you the chance to discuss this piece.
I love that necklace. That's the necklace that Louise James was wearing in her graduation picture from pharmacy school in 1908. I suspect it was a gift from one of the wealthy ladies that helped her pay for school. And I have that necklace. And the only reason I'm not wearing it is it doesn't read well. In person, it reads okay, but it doesn't read well over the internet. So I put it on a black background so that you could see it. But it's just glorious. It's a choker, and I wear it. I love it. It's a talisman.
It's beautiful. It's truly a beautiful piece. Yeah. So the James Pharmacy, it's not a pharmacy anymore, but the building is there in Saybrook, right?
Yes. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, so there's a minimal amount that they can do to the outside. The inside doesn't look anything like it did. It's been through, I think, probably 6 or 7 owners since my aunt sold it after Miss James died. It was, for a while, it was an art gallery. It was gorgeous. My mother loved that because he redid, with all white walls and stuff so he could display artwork. Most recently, that I know of, it was part of a bed and breakfast. There's a building next door called the Pratt Tavern, which was from 16 something or other. And the 2 buildings form kind of a bed and breakfast. There was a restaurant where the soda fountain and the main part of the pharmacy was. I don't know what's going on there now. It may have just recently been sold, but I haven't been keeping up. And my one contact person doesn't seem to really know what's going on. But it is definitely still there. It's number 2 Pennywise Lane, which I love. It's right across from the Congregational Church.
No, I know it well. Well, I want to thank you. Unless there's other questions, Nicole.
We have one more question that I would love to share with you. Again, from Sarah. She is very excited to see the documentary. Of course, with the sneak peek tonight, you saw a little bit of it. She wants to know if there are any plans to make the Narrows into a movie or a mini series or anything of that sort.
No one's ever expressed any interest in making a film of it. There is an option on the street, but there have been options on and off through the years that really haven't gone anywhere. And I don't know what with, California shut down and not reopening again until probably the middle of June, if then. I don't know whether, how that's going to move along. But, if anybody expresses interest in the Narrows as a film, I'll certainly let you know. I think that would be wonderful.
It would be amazing. It truly would be.
If it happens, we'd love to air it.
Yes, David Diggs has to play Link.
Oh yes. Usually my go-to is Idris, right? But he'd be too old for that role.
He's a little too old at this point. I know. Because when the street first started being optioned, my mother wanted Oprah, and then she wanted Whoopi Goldberg. Well, they're way too old now, to play Ludi. So
but there's so many amazing actresses. There's Viola Davis. I mean, there's so many people. But I want to thank you so much. I could talk to you for hours. As you know, we have spoken on the phone for hours. It's always such a pleasure. And, the story of your family is just one of the great stories, not just of Connecticut Black history, but of African-American history at large. So we thank you for sharing it with us today.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. This has been wonderful. It's delightful. And I will send the link for the donations. And you can leave the link to the video up on your website. I mean, people are free to look at it. It's on Vimeo. so anybody
great.
can listen through to it. So, just leave it up there, and I'll send you the information about the. Okay. Yes, you found it. Who
I
found
did.
that?
I know it's quite
Wait,
long.
Nicole, you are
We will copy this into the description on our video. It is not in there currently, but we will have it there as well. You can see it across your screen, but we will get it into our description as well so that it's a little bit easier to find.
This is wonderful.
Of course.
This is the NEA. It's been a banner day today.
Well, we're proud to be in that company, so thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Of course.
You're welcome.
And we want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Of course, if you would like to get any of Ann or Elisabeth Petry's books, we encourage you to go onto bookshop.org to support local and independent bookstores. We do, of course, want to thank you again, Liz, for sharing your family's story with us. It's fascinating. It's wonderful.
This is wonderful.
So excited.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Again, so thank you all for joining us this evening and have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thanks.